Okay, so today we'll be talking about a problem which appears to be a medicinal problem, totally medicinal problem to start with until lately. But we surgeons, as you all know, we've got a tendency to enter into those areas where you really don't require a surgeon's participation. But it all worked out for our well in the end. The reason being that this was hitherto considered to be a purely medicinal disease, diabetes, and until about a few years back, nobody thought the surgeons would get a foothold into this particular arena. Now let's look at the magnitude of this problem. If you look at the magnitude of this problem, type 2 diabetes mellitus, it accounts for almost 90-95% of all cases of diabetes. It's a growing pandemic. Affects almost 415 million, almost 8.8% people worldwide. And the projections are that by 2030, it will be affecting more than 500 million people. And the funny part is 60% of these are from Asia, increasing more rapidly in Asia. The current medical therapy is to a certain extent relatively unsatisfactory. The reason being that there are persons, a group of patients who do not respond to insulin therapy, nor they respond to medicinal therapy satisfactorily, of course. They do have some kind of a control, but such a fluctuating control. So there is a group of patients where the medicinal problems and they persist, the diabetes level persists, the blood sugar level persists, and becomes a problem to control their diabetes level. So then what's the solution? We as surgeons, do we have any kind of a solution? Now let's look at what happened about 5 to 10 years back. The International Federation of Obesity Surgery, the figures say that a phenomenal increase in the number of laparoscopic bariatric interventions and the remarkable improvement in their safety profile. That was none. Number two was the last 20 years, the bariatric surgery noticed a 10-fold increase and the highest growth was seen in Asia. The bariatric surgery is the most commonly performed surgical procedure in USA today. Think of this. The most common surgery being done in USA is bariatric. Not so with India, but I don't know, in the near future that may become a reality. But otherwise, is the most commonly done procedure in USA today. Interestingly, European figures from Center of Excellence say that the 30-day mortality of lab bariatric procedures stands at 0.012%. Now imagine that a Whipple's operation or even a plain gastrectomy operation has got a higher mortality rate. And you're talking about a 30-day mortality rate. These are the European figures from Centers of Excellence. That basically means those centers have been carrying out this procedure fairly for a long period of time. Now, despite the 10-fold increase in incidence, it is 100% safer as compared to a normal surgical procedure, right? A major surgical procedure. But you may think that why am I talking about a bariatric surgical procedure? And what, isn't it out of place? And what has this got to do with a type 2 diabetes mellitus problem? Now, as with all treatment modalities, especially surgical, there's often a carryover or concomitant result or results. Basically meaning that we carry out some kind of a surgical procedure, there are effects, there are bound to be effects which do appear and at first instance may appear to be side effects, but they work for the wellness of a patient in some other context. Similarly, following bariatric surgery, one of the noticeable postoperative findings was a fall in the blood sugar levels across all diabetic patients. And this accidentally discovered benefits, including the one on blood sugar, spell out into significant results. But the question is whether these results are worth following up. We did find this kind of a result, agreed, but are they worth following up? Now, if you further look at the evidence to support this, we say yes, this would be worth following up. But is there any evidence to support this basically concept that yes, surgery or the effect of bariatric procedures on patients finding a low sugar level is going to be beneficial for patients? Is there any evidence to support it? Now, if you look at the evidences, number one evidence would be the evidence of history and milestones. Now, this is historical evidence, right? So, number one, since 1950s, if you look at 1950s, post-gastrectomy and gastric bypass surgery, later open bariatric procedures. Initially, they used to do these bariatric procedures as an open procedure. So been done since 1950, right? Now, either complete normalization or better control of raised fasting blood sugar level or a random blood sugar level was seen in these patients who carried out who were subjected to any kind of a gastrectomy or a gastric bypass surgery. This was believed at that time to be because of reduced calorie intake and loss of weight. A person's stomach was reduced by 2/3. He had only 1/3 stomach after a partial gastrectomy, or he had a bypass procedure, like for example, a gastric genostomy for some other kind of a disease. And what did he notice? That he used to lose weight. Agreed. And they thought it was because of the reduced calorie intake and loss of weight that this was responsible for this kind of a result. The first publication to actually notice the association of bariatric and diabetes was out in 1995. At that time, they started doing some kind of laparoscopic procedures, and 1995, they noticed the association between bariatric surgery and diabetes. 2002, Dixon and O'Brien, 64% of their patients with laparoscopic gastric binding, they had a diabetes remission at 1 year. Notice, it is 1 year that's required for the decrease in the blood sugar level. 2003, 83% of laparoscopic gastric binding procedures normalized fasting blood sugar level. 2004 was a big analysis. See, 136 studies, more than 22,000 patients. They showed complete remission of type 2 diabetes mellitus in 80% patients after bariatric surgery. Similarly, in 2006, this was again a very, very important study. This was a Swedish obese subject study group, larger 10-year follow-up study. They followed these patients for 10 years. And they found what? They found significant improvement in their diabetes level. The Greenville series was a 20-year study of laparoscopic gastric binding. Remember, see, 20-year study. And this 20-year study, they found there was 80% remission of diabetes. Now, JAMA in 2008, they randomized controlled trial. They started randomized controlled trial of LGB, that is laparoscopic gastric binding, versus medical therapy. And what they found was even this showed, or because the results are now available, and they found a remarkable increase in the control of diabetes. What is evidence number 2? This was clinical evidence. Sorry. So this was clinical number 1. Now let's see the clinical evidence number 2. The evidence number 2 was that the remission of diabetes after any kind of obesity surgery is what is surgical procedure dependent. It's surgical procedure dependent. Look, laparoscopic gastric binding, 48%. See, 48%. Very slow. Roux-en-Y gastric bypass, 84%. And immediate. Biliopancreatic diversion, 95% and immediate. So what do we have? We have a complete resolution, almost 76.8% patients, more than 3/4, an improvement in another 10% patients, right? And this was basically procedure dependent. This procedure gave the best results. The other ones didn't. And you see this on this chart. You find the resolution of diabetes mellitus in a biliopancreatic bypass is 99%. And 84%, gastric binding 48%. Right? So this was basically the picture, the scenario, and overall you had a 77%. This was clinical evidence number 2. Clinical evidence number 3. It is time dependent. Even before weight loss has occurred. This is very, very important. Even before weight loss has occurred, now what do you find? You find that the patient has a control of his blood sugar level. Post laparoscopic gastric binding, agreed. It occurs within months and several weeks. But what about BPD and Roux-en-Y gastric bypass? Within days to weeks after surgery. Why does it happen so? It cannot be explained on the basis of either a weight loss or on the basis of decreased calorie requirement. And even after 10 years post surgery, despite the fact that the patient may have gained weight, the recurrence of blood sugar level or diabetes is rare. Okay? Now, clinical evidence number 4, and that is perhaps one of the most conclusive ones, and that is the type 2 diabetes mellitus remission occurs in non-obese persons, non-obese, and has been reported in such. 2007, Cohen reported that in 2 patients where he did this kind of surgery in 22, BMI between 22 to 34, and he found complete reversal of hyperglycemia and HbA1c level. This was a very important landmark study. So agreed, we have all kinds of clinical evidence, but do we have some kind of experimental evidence? Is there any experimental evidence available which tells you yes, this is also important, and there's something to support your basically hypothesis that surgery may be beneficial in these patients? Now, as subjects for this experiment, they picked up these non-obese. Remember, non-obese is very important. Non-obese albino male with type 2 diabetes. Okay. Now, this was what this mimicked the human diabetes spectrum as what it had similar metabolic, it has similar hormonal and similar vascular disorders just like in human diabetes disease. And this all characterized by a similar fasting hyperglycemia, impaired secretion of insulin in response to glucose, isolated pancreatic beta cell decrease in numbers, and hepatic and peripheral insulin resistance and polyuria, all resembling what you find in patients of a human diabetes, right? Late complications were also identical, and they had retinopathy, microangiopathy, neuropathy, and nephropathy. They were all there in such albino rats. Now, what did they do with these rats? Now, the pioneer in this experiment was an Italian surgeon working in New York, and this was known as Francisco Rubino. He was working as the chief of gastrointestinal and metabolic surgery at the Cornell Medical College in New York City. Now, what did he do? He picked up two groups of these rats who were diabetic, but not obese, remember? And one was controlled, the other was basically the patient or the rat who had diabetes, and they were subjected to a bypass procedure of the upper intestine. Right? The other group, which was a control group, he did some other kind of a surgery known as pretend operation. Pretend operation means it is surgery where no bypass was done, any other kind of gut surgery was done, which did not bypass the upper intestine. And what did he find? He found that in those he did the bypass surgery, upper intestine bypass, there was a huge decrease in the blood sugar level. In the other group, there was no decrease in the blood sugar level. Now, when this control group he did the surgery, pretend surgery, there was no fall. But when this control group was now subjected to bypass, he found that the sugar fell. Right? But the most interesting part was when this group of patients, mice, in whom or the rats, when he reversed the procedure, he did a bypass, he reversed it. Now what happened? The diabetes reappeared. It reappeared, right? So this was the most interesting part of the surgery. So when you reverse the procedure, the diabetes returned. Now this is conclusive evidence that this bypass had led to something which controls the diabetes. When the bypass was reversed, the diabetes returned. What more experimental evidence do you want in such a group of rats? So he published this in 2004, 2006. And at that time, they started really thinking in terms of that there has to be some kind of a surgical, there has to be some kind of a defect in the proximal intestine, which is probably responsible for the generation of diabetes. So the reduced calorie intake and partial cholesterol obesity are not the main reasons. They cannot be the main reason. Why? Because the time period doesn't add up. It doesn't add up. Because no way the weight loss could be substantial in 1 month. Suppose if you're weighing 90 kilograms and you got diabetes, you go ahead and get a obesity surgery done. Now you're going to lose in the first year about 4, 5, 6 kilograms, not more than that. So in 1 month, you cannot be losing enough weight to confirm to the idea that you can have a correction of diabetes. There has to be some other reason related to the intestine, especially the part which has been bypassed, namely the proximal part of the small intestine, which is responsible for the diabetes. Now, so mechanism of benefits, they started hypothesizing. The hypothesis was, as why is this happening? The early and probably the main mechanism has to be the alteration in the enteroinsular axis, which shift towards the increased insulin effect. A part may be played by severe calorie restriction, no doubt, but that's not the early part. And there has to be increased fat loss, right? Now, which is known as the adipo-insular axis. Now, let's go a bit further. The problem is probably in the duodenum and proximal jejunum. Agreed, there has to be some problem. But when they started investigating, they came up with conflicting evidence. What are the conflicting evidence? When nutrients passage is diverted from the upper intestine, diabetes resolves. Clear from the experiment and even the bariatric procedure. The same bypass. Now look at the non-diabetic patient. Suppose if you do this bypass in non-diabetic, what's going to happen? What is going to happen? You're a normal person, no diabetes. This bypass procedure has been done. In fact, if you bypass the upper intestine, it may even impair the mechanism that regulate your blood glucose level, leading to a rise in a blood sugar level. Why should that happen? I'm a normal person. I don't have blood sugar rise. And for some reason, the bypass has been done, which is now bypassing my duodenum and the jejunum. And what do I find? I find that I'm becoming diabetic. Why should that occur? So inference is what? The inference is probably in the small intestine. Normally, there has to be secretion of a factor which is regulating the body sugar level. Agreed. But is absent in diabetic. Agreed. Or is being counterbalanced by some other overpowering diabetogenic factor. This factor is the culprit. The normal factor is there, which controls the blood sugar. But what is happening in a diabetic patient? There has to be secretion of some other factor which is controlling or overpowering your normal factor. Right? So, the mechanism of resolution after gastrointestinal bypass surgery is either because of enhanced secretion of something good for glucose homeostasis or reduced production of something bad, the anti-incretins for glucose homeostasis. These have been incretins which are controlling, anti-incretins which lead to a rise in the blood sugar level. That is very clear, right? And that is why you have a proximal bowel hypothesis and a distal bowel hypothesis, which are important hypotheses if you want to understand what really is happening in a patient of diabetes. The proximal bowel hypothesis says this is the proximal bowel, see, and this is basically the intestine. Now, this is a Roux-en-Y, typical Roux-en-Y bypass. You have made a gastric 15 to 30 ml pouch. You connected the jejunum and you've left this part as the biliopancreatic part, right? Now, this has been bypassed. Now, no food is going out here. No food here. It is only the drainage of the secretions right from the pylorus to the pancreas, the bile, and all these things being delivered out here. But no food out here. Because there is no food, there is no stimulus to any kind of secretion. It will be only basal secretion. So the exclusion of the duodenal nutrient passage, this is the duodenal nutrient passage, may offset a counterbalance and abnormality of gastrointestinal physiology responsible for insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. So what we are basically saying is that a diabetic patient, some factor is being released from this part of the intestine, which when the food doesn't go in that particular area, it is not being released. When food goes out here, that anti-incretin is being released. So that anti-incretin being released leads to what? It leads to a poor control of the blood sugar. Now, because my food is not going out here, so that bad factor, which is known as anti-incretin, is not being released anymore. That is the proximal bowel hypothesis. There is another hypothesis to this, and that is perhaps the more easily understood, and that is the distal bowel hypothesis. And what is the distal bowel hypothesis? The distal bowel hypothesis, again the same figure. Again the same figure. Nothing wrong with this figure, right? Now here what is happening? When the food enters this part, it goes directly into this leg. Agreed? It is bypassed. So this was the proximal bowel, and we know the hypothesis is there. But what is happening? As soon as the food goes here, in what time do you think will the food reach to this part of the bowel or the ileum? Within 5 to 10 minutes. Within 5 to 10 minutes. So what else is happening in the bypass? One, I'm bypassing the proximal. At the same time, I'm delivering this food within 5 minutes to this particular area of the intestine. This delivery of food so early to this particular area, it stimulates the secretion of good substances. These good substances are those which are controlling your sugar, known as incretins. And why? Because there are a group of cells in this particular area, the ileal cells, which are known as L cells in this particular area, which are a storehouse of secretion of a number of incretins. chief among them being GLP-1, right? So now we understand one thing. We understand that any kind of bypass of this particular area, is going to decrease the bad from here and going to increase the good from here. In simple language, very easy to understand, right? It's very easy to understand that good is being stimulated, bad is being depressed. Simple. So here what has happened? What has happened is the anti-incretin has been decreased and the incretins have been increased. More scientific terminology, right? Now, when you talk about the enteroinsular axis, what is the enteroinsular axis? Enteroinsular axis basically the axis where the food stimulates your intestine to secrete what? Insulin. So what is happening? The food entering your bowel stimulates insulin. That's why enteroinsular axis. Okay. Now, it is glucose dependent. GIP was the first one, and this is basically the incretin or the incretin which should be found under normal circumstances in your proximal bowel. I said, look, I told you that even the proximal bowel has a good effect on you until it gets overpowered by something bad. So that good which is secreted in the proximal intestine is known as the glucose-dependent insulinotropic peptide or gastric inhibitory peptide. Where is it secreted from? From the K cells of the duodenum and the jejunum. Agreed. Now, 50% of the total, see, this is not a minor factor. It is a major factor. 50% of your blood sugar control by the incretin effect is being controlled by this GIP, secreted from the K cells. And secreted by because of the response to luminal glucose. The glucose has entered into the proximal bowel, stimulated the secretion of GIP, and that is going to control the blood sugar levels. And how does it do that? It does that by stimulating the insulin secretion, expansion of the beta cells, and leads to a control of the sugar. Agreed? Now, in diabetics, what is happening with the GIP? Is it less than normal? No, it's not less than normal. It is normal GIP secretion. But as we said in the proximal bowel hypothesis, that there is a defective response. What defective response? Something bad has overpowered it. Something bad has overpowered it. So there's nothing wrong with the GIP. GIP is there. But that GIP is not being controlled by or is not having its effect. Why? Because now being controlled or overpowered by some other bad factor or the anti-incretin. Right? So this anti-incretin counteracts the GIP effect and gets secreted from the duodenal. But coming to the distal bowel, what are being secreted from the distal bowel? The first and perhaps the most important one, which has got almost equal effect than the GIP, is the GLP, known as the glucagon-like peptide 1. Why the name glucagon-like peptide? Because it shares the peptide with the glucagon molecule. Both have got almost similar peptide, but it has got absolutely opposite effect. Opposite effect. Again, secreted from the L cells in the ileum. As a result of what? The food in the bowel, direct stimulation, and indirect neurohormone stimulation by the duodenal secretion. 6 times increase after a carbohydrate meal. You have a carbohydrate meal, 6 times increase. What does it do? It reduces your food intake, decreases your appetite, slows your gastric emptying, stimulates insulin, improves its sensitivity, enhances glucose disposal, suppresses the glucagon release. See, it's got opposite effect of glucagon, and increases and maintains the beta cell function. This is totally known as the ileal brake mechanism. The GLP-1 has got an ileal brake mechanism. It breaks. It breaks down what? It breaks down the whole function of the bowel, so that ultimately the absorption is reduced, and at the same time the insulin is geared up or stimulated to have its maximum effect. Right? And that is why in diabetes, remember in diabetes the GIP was not less. It was not less. Remember I told you that, right? But in diabetes, the GLP-1 is less than normal. And that's why the analogs of GLP-1 are now being used in medicinal substances. Exenatide is one of them. It's in normal usage for control of diabetes. It's what? It's a GLP-1 analog, right? Now, the third incretin, I think you should know about these incretins. You may not like to know the details about them. At least you should have a knowledge of these incretins. PYY or peptide YY. It is again secreted from the L cells, from the same part of the ileum. The concentration is increased in the postprandial period. You eat something, the concentration is increased. secreted from the same L cells found in the ileum. It is also secreted from the colon. And how does it exert effect? It exerts effect by acting on particular receptors known as neuropeptide Y receptors. These are important. We have to have a knowledge of bariatrics. And I think this is one of the areas which are now most upcoming areas of laparoscopy, bariatric surgery. Everyone in every other conference where you go, you'll find people talking about only bariatric surgery nowadays, right? Less of other surgery, more of bariatric surgery. So you should know what bariatric surgery is all about. You have to know these peptides, you know, the receptors, achieve the visual understanding of these receptors, right? So it downregulates the NPY receptor, the neuropeptide Y receptor. Where they're located? They're located throughout your body, the CNS, especially the hypothalamus, the spinal cord, the sympathetic system, everywhere. And what does these the NPY receptor stimulation do to you? It reduces the appetite. In reflex, it decreases the ghrelin. It inhibits the gastric motility, NMT. Thus, increases what? The efficiency of digestion, and you always feel full. So, your appetite decreases. It may also suppress the pancreatic secretion, increase the water and electrolyte absorption in the colon. One of the forms of peptide PYY is peptide YY336, which further suppresses appetite and promotes the weight loss. That's why this is the peptide which is now basically being understood more and more commonly. The fourth incretin, oxyntomodulin. These are, remember, all from the L cells. See how beneficial the L cell is for you, right? So oxyntomodulin, a peptide that is co-secreted with GLP and PYY, again from the L cell, similarly L cell. And it is a weak incretin, not a weak incretin. Why? Because it has got 50 times lower effect than GLP-1. It has got similar effect, but 50 times lower than that. Action is again the same, satiety effect, slow gastric empty, and increases energy expenditure. So the ileal brake mechanism again functions, right? And those bariatric procedures which will increase the level of OXM would be desirable. So this is basically what you're looking at. We're looking at those procedures surgically which are going to stimulate the release of these incretins, right? Now, adiponectin produced by what? Adipose tissue. From where? Basically from the bone marrow. It's got an inverse relationship with the BMI as well as insulin resistance, right? The lifestyle induced weight loss increases the adiponectin levels. And higher levels are shown to be protective against development of T2 diabetes by way of its anti-inflammatory and insulin sensitizing properties, right? So it would be deemed advantageous for a bariatric surgical procedure to be associated with an increased adiponectin level. You're looking at what? You're looking at an increase of all the incretins we just now talked about, right? But now comes a very interesting observation, and that is the bile acid. Now, what a bile acid got to do with obesity and type 2 diabetes mellitus? It has got an incretin effect. That was understood only lately. Hormonal effects on weight regulation of bile acids, right? They appear to be important signaling molecules in the regulation of energy expenditure. And what do? They increase the energy expenditure by stimulation or conversion of T4 to the active T3. That's one. They also stimulate GLP-1. They decrease the insulin resistance and improve the mitochondrial metabolism. Postprandial bile acids have been shown to be lower in obese subjects. So a person who is fat has got a low level of bile acids, right? So serum bile acids have been shown to be increased after some kinds of bariatric procedures, especially sleeve gastrectomy, and the mechanism for this increase is still unknown. So it follows from our discussion that an increase in the bile acids would be favorable for energy homeostasis, right? So that brings us to the balance. This is the balance. You got incretins on one hand, you got the anti-incretins on one hand. You're a normal person, the incretins, all these incretins are good. They are all good. And they're maintaining your blood sugar level very well. But if you're diabetic, these factors have now come into play. And these are basically doing what? They're tilting the balance in favor of what? Diabetes 2, type 2 diabetes mellitus, hyperinsulin, resistance, and beta cell depletion. So this is the balance. a balance which has been struck inside the bone, right? Now, having said this much, now we come to the surgical procedures available. Now, for all practical purposes, as of now, there are four main surgical procedures. There are four main surgical procedures, right, for any kind of diabetes control. The four main surgical procedures are the four main bariatric procedures. Number one, the laparoscopic gastric binding, the sleeve gastrectomy, the BPD, and the Roux-en-Y gastric bypass, which is considered to be the gold standard of bariatric surgery for control of obesity. That's the gold standard, right? Now, the first one, or the first group, you'll find a number of other procedures mentioned out here. Banded sleeve gastrectomy, endoscopic sleeve gastroplasty, banded gastric plication. Now, these are all new procedures come into the market. I would say in the market. Why? Because more and more people are devising these procedures. They devise and then they put this out that, look, this procedure has got a very good effect, right? We'll talk about that later, what harm is doing or what benefit is doing. But we have to remember that these two procedures, the gastric banding and the sleeve gastrectomy. On the other hand, these basically are all geared to what? They all geared towards delivering a decreased amount of food, allowing less amount of food into the stomach. As a result of what? As a result, what happens is less food, less calories, lots of it. So whether you have a gastric binding or a sleeve gastrectomy, your volume of stomach has been shrunk to such a low level that you can't eat enough. You can't eat enough. You're full by the time that you've taken just one or two gulps. That's all. The second group of procedures are those which bypass the foregut and they deliver nutrients early to the distal part of the ileum or the nutrients to the distal part of the bowel or the ileum. And these are basically the Roux-en-Y, the gold standard, and then the biliopancreatic diversions, which are basically with or without duodenal transfer. We just talk about that in a short while. But then there are special procedures which are typical for diabetes only. Some of them could be an intragastric balloon, ileal transposition, endoscopic bypass sleeve. I've enumerated some of them out here. I'll just show you in the subsequent slides, right? Now, the first one is the lab gastrictive restrictive procedure. And what does it say? It is really a procedure which takes a long time. It takes weeks for the control of type 2 diabetes. It doesn't go early. It takes weeks. And less efficient reversing diabetes. Because it is working by what? By the first premise, that is decreasing your weight. It's not working by the premise of the proximal bowel hypothesis or the distal bowel hypothesis. It's only decreasing your weight. That's why it takes a long period of time for the diabetes to be controlled. Right? Now, the second procedure basically is the sleeve gastrectomy, which is perhaps one of the most commonly done procedures. Despite the fact that now in obesity you say that the Roux-en-Y is the gold standard, doesn't make a difference. You may say whatever you like. But what is happening right now is the sleeve is the most commonly done procedure as of now worldwide. And you would be astonished to know that about 10 years back, the most commonly done obesity procedure in the USA was what? The guess would be far off the mark. The guess was, if you guess, you would not be able to guess it. And the most common procedure done was basically laparoscopic gastric binding, the most primitive procedure. 10 years back, USA, number one procedure, gastric binding. Europe, number one procedure, sleeve gastrectomy. And at that time, the Roux-en-Y was catching up. And that's why, as of today, the Roux-en-Y is the gold standard. But nevertheless, because sleeve gastrectomy is the most easily done procedure, why? It just requires staplers, 4 or 5 firing of staplers, and then up, back home, the patient and you. And what has to be remembered is that the diameter of the sleeve is very, very important. It cannot be too large, it cannot be too small. Right? Too small is going to burst out. Too large, then you have no effective weight loss. Right? The morbidity is very low, 0.2%. That's why that's one of the main reasons why this procedure is done very, very easily. And even a basic laparoscopic surgeon, a basic advanced, not a very highly advanced laparoscopic surgeon, a basically advanced laparoscopic surgeon can easily do this procedure. And how does it do it? How does it decrease the diabetes? Number one, the ghrelin, which is secreted mainly from the fundus of the stomach. which is the hunger hormone for you. There's only one single hunger hormone, ghrelin. So when you're doing a sleeve gastrectomy, you're basically cutting out the fundus. When you're cutting out the fundus, that basically is decreasing the amount of ghrelin being secreted. And in addition to this, because the volume of the stomach is so small, so whatever you eat would be immediately transferred very fast into the distal bowel. So rapid nutrient transit to the distal bowel is stimulates the incretins that we just now talked about. The two things that are happening with a sleeve gastrectomy. So it gives a very good control of obesity. It gives an equally good control of your diabetes. And that's why one of the very, very preferred procedures now. There are a number of modifications of sleeve. As of now, I'll just show you in the subsequent slide. But now coming to the gold standard. And that gold standard is not very difficult to understand. You have a pouch, 50 to 30 ml. You have a diameter of only 1 centimeter. Why? Remember this. This is very important. Even when you do gastric genotomy in one of your operations, when you're doing it, let's forget bariatric for a moment. You find a gastric carcinoma, you do a palliative surgery, a gastric genotomy. The question, however, is almost what should be the length of the cut in the stomach and the bowel? What should be the diameter of the opening that you're making? Remember that it should never be a very large opening. Just compare it to the pylorus. After all, the food is going to the pylorus, right? Similarly, when you have the food going from the stomach into the distal bowel, if you create a large opening, the dumping syndrome appears. A very small opening, it is not functional. So it should be in the region of about 1 to 3 centimeters. Never more than 5 centimeters in any case. Never more than that. The moment you go over 3 centimeters, you're creating what? A dumping syndrome. Agreed? Now, the decreased blood sugar in these patients, now here what's happening? The food enters here, immediately goes into this limb and immediately the ileum. Why? Because this whole thing has been bypassed. So Roux-en-Y, you have bypassed the proximal and you have gone to the distal. That means both your proximal hypothesis and distal hypothesis are both of them are working for you in the patient in whom you have done a Roux-en-Y, which is the gold standard for obesity and even for diabetes control, one of the gold standard. And that occurs within minutes. It goes within minutes to your distal bowel or the eye, and an immediate increase in the secretion of incretins, right? So let's see what this is about. The BPD and the BPD with a duodenal switch operation. Now, I wouldn't be going to the details of this because that's part of the bariatric surgery lectures, but here just a demonstration, a representation. You have the proximal bowel stomach. This is the proximal stomach. You have that pouch of about 50 to 30 ml. That's no more than that. And you have a limb of 250 centimeters. This should be constant. What is not constant is the site where you connect what is known as the biliopancreatic limb. This is known as the biliopancreatic limb. Why? It is draining what? It is draining the bile, it is draining the pancreas. That's why it is a biliopancreatic limb. Now, this biliopancreatic limb can open into this alimentary limb. This is the alimentary limb where the food is coming at a point here, at a point here, at a point here. Now, what is the absorptive limb right now? It's only 50 centimeters. Because only in this part of the bowel, both the things are mixing. So whatever digestion has to occur would occur in this 50 centimeters. Agreed? The biliopancreatic secretion being delivered here, the food reaching up to this place, and together they would be mixing, digestion occurring, and absorption occurring. All three in this 50 centimeters. So the more the obesity, the less the length. So if you have let's say a patient who has got a BMI of let's say about 35, you may afford to have 100. You have 100 here, 100 here. But you have a very severely obese person, 250, 50 here, 200 here. So basically, I'm just trying to tell you at this point in time is that the attachment of the biliopancreatic limb to the alimentary limb at this particular point is a variable. It could be towards 200, it could be towards 50. Anyway, so what's happening here is that there has been a biliopancreatic diversion. Now, BPD is not a specific operation. Remember that. It's not a specific operation. It is a physiological alteration that you're carrying out. You're altering the physiology. It's not only a specific operation. This alteration of the anatomy you're doing and the alteration of the physiology you're doing. You are trying to drain the pancreatic and the bile into this small bowel in this particular area instead at the DJ junction. Now, here see the duodenum stump has been left as such. Agreed? Now, the problem with this is that the food immediately goes here and it creates a lot of problems. Dumping syndromes are very common in this kind of a procedure. Now, suppose we can utilize the function of the pylorus. At the same time, try to deliver food early. So what have I done? Instead of duodenal stump being closed, what am I doing? I'm basically taking the pylorus and the first part of the duodenum out here. I'm utilizing these two things. I'm utilizing the duodenum and the pylorus. What have I done out here? I have thrown them out. I've thrown the pylorus off. I've thrown the first part of the duodenum off and closed the second part of the duodenum out here, right? This part has been excised and removed. But in the duodenal switch, what I've done is that I've preserved the pylorus and the first part of the duodenum of the stomach along with the sleeve, and now I'm attaching this to the duodenum. So the duodeno-ileostomy has been done, what is known as the duodenal switch operation. Is that clear? Not very difficult to understand. In the first one, the duodenum and the first part of duodenum and pylorus have been excised. In this, what has been done is that here the duodenum, the first part of duodenum and pylorus have been left behind, and the ileum is now being attached here. So the function of pylorus is here. Because the function of pylorus is here, so dumping syndromes and the complication related to dumping syndromes are much less out here. The attachment is same here. 100 common channel, 100 this time, 150 here, because remember 250 is the standard that is kept. So 150 and 100, 50, 150, whatever, or whatever you want, 200. So this would depend upon the degree of obesity in these patients, right? What else needs to be done in these patients? The choroid has to be removed, appendectomy has to be done, right? In all these patients, okay? So this is again a procedure where you are doing two things: the proximal hypothesis and the distal hypothesis both are working out, right? Now, a procedure which has now come up lately and which is now being taken up more and more surgeons who are basically not adept at carrying out the Roux-en-Y gastric bypass. Now remember, Roux-en-Y gastric bypass requires a very high level, advanced level of laparoscopic expertise. It's not a very easy operation. It's a very difficult operation. Operation is viewed where you're, I think it would just be a step below doing a laparoscopic pancreatic excision or a Whipple's operation. Just a step below that. But why? Because in that you have to mobilize and you carry out 2 or 3 anastomosis. Now, they came up with a good alternative to that, and this was basically where they tried to do a laparoscopic single anastomosis, and that's why they call it a mini gastric bypass. Now, if you look at this procedure, this is a Roux-en-Y gastric bypass, and this Roux-en-Y gastric bypass, in this Roux-en-Y gastric bypass, you have to be, sorry. Yes. So here what do you see? You see the gastric pouch and you see the transected part. So the gastric pouch and the biliopancreatic limb being attached to the distal pouch. Now here what do you see? So that means you have to cut one out here, cut here and cut here. 3 anastomosis being done. Now here what is being done? Only cut one and you have not transected the bowel, you take it like a loop. Just like in gastrogenostomy. What do you do a gastrogenostomy? You take a loop and anastomose it to the stomach. As opposed to say a Roux-en-Y gastrogenostomy, where you do a complete transection, attach a limb to the gastrogenostomy site. Similarly, that's the only difference. So here you have not done a transection. So you saved the transection and the anastomosis related to the transection. You've just taken a loop and anastomosed it to the distal part of the sleeve gastric. That's why it is known as a single anastomosis or mini gastric bypass. Now this can be done by 2 methods. One, you can anastomose the jejunum out here. You take the jejunum anastomosis out here. It is known as a single anastomosis duodenojejunal bypass, right? Or SADJS. Or you can take a different thing and you can take the ileum. See here what have I taken? I've taken the ileum. So mini gastric bypass could either be a jejunal, a duodenojejunal bypass, or a duodenal-ileal bypass. It's more easily done and you don't require the expertise to the level of doing a Roux-en-Y gastric bypass. Slightly level expertise. Why? Because less anastomosis, less suturing has to be done. Because even with a stapler, you have to suture. You have to suture against to which you insert the stapler. That has to be done. So in these cases, that is basically the advantage. But now coming to those procedures which are peculiar to diabetes, and later on they were again found out to be better even in obesity. But it started first as a diabetic procedure, and this was the ileal interposition. Now, ileal interposition basically means that you take a segment of ileum from here and insert it here, from its normal ileal position to a jejunal position. So what have you done? You have done basically a 10 centimeter segment, only a 10 centimeter segment from this particular area, from 5 centimeters proximal. This is ileocecal wall, 5 centimeters, and you take this segment, and this segment on the mesentery. You can't have a loose segment. It would still be on the mesentery so that the vascularity is maintained. And then you take it where? You take it and attach it to 15 to 20 centimeters on the DJ and insert it out here. Anastomose number 1, anastomose number 2, anastomose number 3. 3 anastomoses, right? Now, what does it achieve? Now, what have I taken from here? A part of the bowel which is rich in L cells. What do these L cells do? These L cells are now showing increased incretin production. Now, the food through the normal route would have reached this particular area after 2.5 to 3 hours. Now, what is happening? Within half an hour, the food reaches this particular segment of ileum and it stimulates the secretion of GLP-1 and similar incretin, right? Now, there are modifications to the ileal transposition. Now, ileal interposition basically for the first time was designed by a Brazilian surgeon, and he was known as the de Paula. It's not de Paula's interposition, and now one of the foremost proponents to that is Ugale. Now, this interposition I just now told you. Now, there are modifications to this interposition also, and that is that initially the interposition was without any sleeve. Now they are done it with a sleeve gastrectomy. In addition to this, they got a second modification, and that is a diverted sleeve gastrectomy. This is a diverted sleeve gastrectomy. I don't think you need to go into the details of this, but just remember that even the ileal interposition comes with 2 modifications to it. But ultimately, what it boils down, all this boils down to is a better control of sugar level. Why? Because there is a increased amount of secretion of incretin, right? Now, the Ugale then came up with a diabetes remission score known as the DRS, and this was very recent, 2019. And this is basically a score which is going to predict the diabetes remission following your procedure, whether it was interposition number 1 or type 2 or type 3 or the second modification, right? And they took the help of 7 parameters: the age, the duration of diabetes, macro and microvascular complications, pre-operative insulin use, the BMI, and stimulated C-peptide response prior to surgery. And they took all these 7 parameters and they took 3 grades to it. I'm not going to go into the details how they graded, but just remember, the higher the grade, the lower the chance of remission. So you can easily predict to a person who says, look, I want to get a surgery done for my diabetes. I easily predict that, look, you're going to have a fairly good chance, you have a less chance, you can have a very good chance, whatever. So you can at least predict that the remission would be basically of what kind. Now, coming to the other procedure, which are very, very interesting procedure, just to a few of these procedures. And the first one is an implantable gastric stimulation system. Now, what's happening out here? I've got 3 pairs of bipolar electrodes. Now, one pair is this, going behind, second and third. Now, the first pair is basically at the fundus. The other 2 are in the region of the antrum and the pulmonary canal. Now, these are bipolar stitch electrodes, and these are basically attached. You have got an implantable pulse generator. It generates pulses, and this is subcutaneously implanted in your body, right? Left side of the abdomen. And these are connected. Now, these electrodes are easily inserted laparoscopically. So, no major surgery done. And you got a portable charger, just like you got a portable charger for your phone, mobile phone. Similarly, you got a portable charger out. And the patient van is a handheld programming device to be activating this whole thing. Now, the external programmer is also there. That is very interesting. And your physician is the external programmer. He feeds the programmer inside that how frequent he requires these discharges. Now, what are these implantable electrodes doing for you? The implantable electrodes basically are doing what? They are delivering gastric contractile modulation signals. You modulate your gastric activity in conformity with the slow waves that are being generated inside the stomach. You all know the stomach has got a slow wave generation all there, even in your fasting. Why? Because it has to propel the gastric secretion onward, right? So it results in what? Augmentation of gastric contraction. It modulates the food entry into the intestine, modulates the satiety. It reduces the plasma ghrelin and modifies the GI hormone level, right? Now, the one which is now in the market, now this was the one I just now told you about is the earliest, but now in the market right now is one which has been approved by the FDA in 2015. It's known as the V block, and this V block, it is basically blocking the vagal nervous signaling. That is what it's doing. It is blocking your vagus nerve signaling. Signaling is being blocked. And how? By delivering high frequency electrical impulses directly to the vagal nerve. Now, the advantage is that this is kind of a vagotomy, right? But without unwanted side effects and irreversibility. It can be reversed easily. The moment you stop these pulses, the vagotomy disappears, right? And it's been approved by FDA in 2015, and more than 700 patients have been implanted with the V block worldwide with very good results. A very, very interesting idea, and that was, we were talking about the proximal hypothesis, and we said that the food, if it is bypassing the proximal part of the bowel, that means the food should not touch the duodenum, it should not touch the proximal jejunum. Now, suppose if I'm not doing any surgery, and I can devise a method by which the patient is feeding normally, but the food is not touching the mucosa of the proximal bowel, and straight away going and touching the mucosa of the distal bowel. Is that possible? Yes. Why not give a coating inside? If I can fit a sleeve inside, a mucosal sleeve inside, which is covering the mucosa on all sides, and through the sleeve the food is going. And that is exactly what the duodenal jejunal bypass sleeve attains. It can be fitted very easily by doing an endoscopy. The sleeve, the funnel of the sleeve fits in your pylorus, and then the rest of it is taken down into the jejunum, right? 23 excess weight loss at 12 weeks. And this was the first study initially. 4 diabetic patients had normal fasting glucose levels during BJBS therapy. A lot of patients have this sleeve now. It's not only 4 patients, hundreds and hundreds of patients have this sleeve now. This was the earliest when it was first, put in for the first time, right? So this was a very innovative thinking, and they said the food should not have the mucosa of the duodenum and jejunum. Let me put in a sleeve wherewith the food can be straight away delivered to the island. This is how it looks like. See, this is the part which is attached to the pylorus, and this all goes to the duodenum. It is jejunum right up to the distal part of the jejunum. Now, there are drugs which are now being used, but they are basically, you would say that now I have got an analog of GLP-1. So why go to all this problem? Why go to surgery? I have something to resemble GLP-1. So why the surgery? But 2 things are very, very important to consider. Number 1, after surgery, you've got a 10% or 10 times increase, 10 times increase. By a drug, you've got only 2 to 3 times increase. Point number 1. Point number 2. Now, when you're doing surgery, why only GLP-1? You are taking care of all those factors, known and unknown. We still don't know about number of factors being secreted by the terminal ileum or the part of the jejunum. We don't know a whole lot about anti-incretins. We have recognized only 4 incretins. Why not 6, 8, or 10? How do we know? So basically, when you're putting the surgery, you're basically taking care of multiple hormones would have to be administered if you are trying to emulate the surgical advantage. So that is the main advantage of surgery. You're taking care of both known and unknown factors which are basically being taken care of, right? While in GLP analog, the increase only 2 to 3, and you're taking care of only 1 incretin. You're taking only GLP-1. So 1 incretin and 2 to 3 times. Here with surgery, a number of known incretins, unknown incretins, and 10 times more effectivity. That is the reason why surgery stands out as compared to the analogs which can basically answer full, right? Now, weight loss basically This is basically what we're trying to tell you is why the name metabolic surgery. The reason is that apart from obesity, which is only a small effect of this kind of a surgery, the major effect is on the metabolism, metabolic problems in these patients, the lipid profile, triglyceride levels, the sleep apnea, the hypertension, and of course the blood sugar level. So basically, what you're looking at in this is should be a metabolic surgery. This is besides point, but let me go further. The problem with this surgery is one, and what is the problem? That none of these studies, we talked a whole lot about the diabetes surgery, none of these studies have shown any survival benefit or reduction of type 2 diabetes mellitus or the related end organ damage. They have not been done. And that's why what we are saying right now is that these studies have now been taken up by a number of federations. They're all there. But there's still unanswered questions. And all these unanswered questions. Number one, no proper randomized controlled trials today. Number two, they're all retrospective studies. Number three, all trials were for bariatric patients, not for primary diabetic patients. But we're trying to transpose the data from the bariatric to the diabetic. Have you picked up a group of only diabetic patients and done a study? No, we've not done that yet. A diabetic population would be entirely different in terms of stated macro and microvascular complications. So there is no long-term data about progression of microvascular complications or the cost effectiveness of these surgeries. And that is what is required. And do they have a favorable effect on the cardiovascular risk factors? We don't know. And we also know one thing, that when you do this diabetic surgery, the best results are obtained when there has been a short duration of diabetes. Say a patient has got diabetes for the last 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. Would he be showing the same effect as a patient who's got a diabetes for the last 5 years? No, it will be different. In patient who's also diet controlled and greatest weight loss has been achieved. So this is the group of patients where you have this kind of a response. So what about the non-responders? There are a group of patients who don't respond there. And what are these non-responders? What could be the reason why they don't respond? Number one, the post-operative dietary behavior could not be what has been devised for the patient. Persistent beta cell dysfunction. The beta cell is so less in amount that they are still dysfunctioning. And a persistent insulin resistance, both of which may be the cause of long-standing diabetes. So in these patients, probably a surgery also may not be of good benefit. And that brings us to the important recommendations. You were saying that we'll be talking a whole lot about diabetic surgery. Yes. Does it have some kind of a backing? Some kind of a good backing? Now look at this American Society for Metabolic and Bariatric Surgery recommendations 2019 and 20. See, 1920, last year only. And the recommendations basically go a long way in helping you decide whether you should still stick to diabetic surgery or not. What do they say? Type 2 diabetes, remission 78% individuals. See, almost more than 3/4. An improvement in nearly 90% patients. That just leaves 10% of patients who don't respond. And how do they respond? Their blood sugar normalizes or it lowers. Eliminating or reducing the dosage type of medication required. Initially, I used to have 4 tablets of a particular drug. Now I require 1 tablet. I don't require any tablet. So that has been reduced or modulated. And the improving of diabetes-related health problems. So what do they recommend? Along with ADA, which is the accepted American Diabetes Association for surgery of diabetes type 2, they recommend that if you have BMI more than 40 kilograms per meter square, even if the diabetes is well controlled on medications, doesn't make a difference. Go ahead with surgery. You be subject to surgery. If your BMI is between 35 to 39.9 and diabetes is not well controlled, then you become a candidate for surgical intervention. A patient with BMI 30 to 35, type 2 diabetes mellitus not controlled, but you have major cardiovascular risk factors, then you are fitting for the group of diabetic surgery. So 30-35, you have to have a cardiovascular factor. 35-39, your diabetes should be uncontrolled. More than 40, even if it is well controlled, you are a candidate for surgical intervention. So recommendations, they say that the 4 major procedures are to be stuck to. And what are these 4 major procedures? The Roux-en-Y gastric bypass, the sleeve gastrectomies, adjustable gastric banding, and dural switch operation. And see, they are in the order of recommendation. First, do NY if you can do it. Good. If you can't do it, do a sleeve gastrectomy. If you can't do that, do a gastric banding. And if you are very good surgeon, go ahead and do a dural switch. But you should remember the attended or associated complications which are always shared with the dural switch operation or without dural switch operation. And this was a meeting which was held in Delhi, and Dr. Chaubey was basically responsible for this. Standardization of bariatric metabolic procedures. This was a world consensus meeting, and this was in March in 2018, between March 2024 in New Delhi. And what was the meeting all about? This was organized to define standard versions of 25 bariatric metabolic procedures. See, 4 of them were the standard, classic. I just not told you about those. And 21 were the variant and emerging procedures. And what did they do? They had expert panel and they had audience. And they discussed everything, and then they carried out an electronic voting on the proposal. And this consensus was defined after they had a more than 70% agreement between the panel and the audience. Not only the panel plus audience had more than 70% agreement. It was good. And then they took up that procedure or the modification of the procedure. Now, if you want to look at this complete list of procedures, even in 2020, what are the procedures which are advised for laparoscopic the bariatric or the metabolic interventions for type 2 diabetes mellitus? Now, bariatric and diabetes, this is available on the net. You just go and type this out, and with this, you look for 2020 recommendations, and you have got those recommendations, right? You can have the recommendations, look at those recommendations, you see the whole list of procedures. There are 25 procedures, not possible to show you all these procedures right now, but 4 you all know, and a few I've tried to show you, right? Now, in addition to this, I'm showing the recommendations because you have to have some kind of recommendation. Because we were talking through our hat about all these procedures, theoretically all very good. But what about the acceptability all over the world? Are they there? So this was the second Diabetes Surgery Summit, DSS2, held in UK in 2016. And there were 4 partners to it, all recognized partners. The American Diabetic Association, the IDF, that's the International Diabetic Federation, the Diabetes UK, CDS, and Diabetes India. So there were 5 of them, right? Now, they brought out certain guidelines, or the DSS2 guidelines. It was endorsed by 45 worldwide medical and scientific societies. And they say what? They say that there's not sufficient evidence, clinical and mechanical, to support the inclusion of what? Of metabolic surgery among the anti-diabetes intervention for people with type 2 diabetes and obesity. That is a very strong recommendation. It tells you a lot about the inclusion of now surgery as a treatment modality for diabetes. That says a lot about that, right? Now, so in conclusion, what can we say? Number 1, gastrointestinal bypass procedures, they can improve diabetes by mechanisms beyond changes in food intake and body weight, right? Number 2, anatomic modification of various regions of the GI tract likely contribute to the amelioration of type 2 diabetes mellitus through distinct physiological mechanisms. Number 3, bypass and banding provide effective, durable therapy for all components of metabolic syndrome, including diabetes. Surgical therapy type 2 diabetes is highly effective in patients with severe and mild obesity. And surgery is to be recommended as an important addendum to medicinal treatment.